Hello YouTube, Sidekick here in my trusty F-86 Sabre with a little video today about bombing in the Sabre. I've been wanting to make this video for a while, but I'll be honest with you, figuring out how to actually get consistent bombing in the Sabre took me a little while, so it's been a while coming, but hopefully this video will be helpful if you're trying to learn how to bomb in the F-86. Now, before we get started, it really is important, I think, to understand a little bit about the F-86, where it came from, and how it was designed, because that does affect the way it gets used, essentially, as an iron bomber. And the first thing to understand, of course, is that dropping bombs was never something that the F-86 was expected to do when it was being designed. It was designed at the end of the Second World War, at which point the U.S. Air Force was convinced that the thing that fighters would need to do would be to intercept bombers at high altitude, at far enough distance from U.S. soil to prevent eventually a nuclear attack. And that's what the Sabre was designed to do. It was a high-altitude interceptor. In fact, it wasn't even designed to carry missiles originally. It was just supposed to be a gunfighter. It was effectively like a warbird on steroids. Okay, so this method of bombing is going to use the method that I've used and talked about in other videos, which is the fixed point aim-off method. And it's going to be designed to drop our bombs at about 2,000 feet. That's what the actual size of the reticle is going to give us. So, okay, we're getting out on the runway now, and we'll just take a minute here and get a couple of switches set. They're down behind the control column. The first thing we're going to do is set the sight mode to camera for bombing. You set it to camera. Then we're going to set the switch that drops all of the bombs at the same time rather than the left or right wing. And then the only other thing we have to do is set the sight mode to bombing mode. And I'm also setting up what I call my bombing computer here. Set the switch to bomb, set the dive angle, and also the sight altimeter. I call it a bombing computer, and it really is an analog computer. It's actually a pretty elegant piece of engineering. We'll talk a little bit more about it once we actually get up and started flying. But essentially what it allows you to do is set your sight deflection based on what you expect your dive angle and speed to be, and then it also allows you to set the altitude at which you think you're going to drop. So it's when I say computer, I don't mean a digital computer. I mean literally an analog computer that allows you to compute the drop parameters, and it's essentially based on what you think you're going to be doing when you actually start dropping bombs. We'll talk about how that works and some of its limitations as we get on with the video. For now, why don't we get down the runway here? Now, like a lot of early jets, it takes a little while for the Sabre to make up its mind that it actually wants to leave the ground. Once it's done that, though, it usually gets pretty enthusiastic about getting up there. Just about there. Here's rotation, and we're off. Haven't phoned the Sabre in a while, still hunting around to find my landing gear lever here. Why don't we just do it? Okay, so gear up, flaps up, nose up, and we are ready to go to the range. In case you hadn't guessed, we are at Kobuleti. We're going out to the iron bombing test range, just like we usually do in all of the videos on my channel. If you haven't checked out some of my earlier videos on iron bombing, you might want to do that, because we are going to talk about some of the techniques that I have talked about before in this video. So right now we're just gaining some altitude. Now I am setting up my sight here. So I've left the sight caged, which means it's not moving. It's effectively a fixed sight. But it's still, you can still vary the size of the reticle. I've set it to a wingspan of 50. That's what the dial underneath the sight is. It just affects the size of the reticle, and that's just personal preference at this point. We will talk about caging and uncaging the sight a little bit as we go along. The important thing to remember about the sight when it's caged is that it's not only fixed, but the center of the sight is essentially on the center of rotation of the aircraft. So that's the center of your screen, in a sense, and the world rotates around the point, the center point of the fixed sight. That's very important when we start talking about doing the roll-in and alignment. It's really helpful to have a cue that's actually the middle of the screen, as we'll find out. We've talked a bit about that before in some of the other videos. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the bombing computer here. I call it a computer because essentially what it's doing is it's computing a sight deflection based on the parameters that you are telling it you're going to expect to fly. So the little panel on the left allows you to select what dive angle you think you're going to use, and it's also calibrated so that you can tell it when you think you're going to roll in, at what altitude. Now what that really just does is it tells you what speed you should be when you roll in. It knows the altitude, so it expects a certain speed. So really, the combination of those two things give it dive angle and speed. And then you have the little altimeter, sight altimeter, beside the HUD that allows you to set the altitude that it tells you at which you're going to press the pickle button. So it really is a computer that tells you if you get everything lined up, then this is when you should release the bombs. Now, the first problem with this is that I'm not sure that it's entirely right. The settings that I'm using here are not going to look exactly like my dive parameters. They're settings that I have experimented with and I find that they work, but they don't exactly look like what I'm going to be doing in the dive. I've set it, as you can see, I'm going to roll in from about 15,000 feet, so that's good. I've set it for a dive angle of actually about 55 degrees. Typically, though, my dive angles tend to be between about 40 and 45 for this setting. And you can see that I've set the altimeter line to about 4,000 instead of about the 4,500 that it recommended. So I'm not using exactly the numbers that the site is telling me to, but I am using it with settings that I know work for me. So I don't know if it's a DCS modeling problem, I don't know if it's my eyesight or my flying, but I couldn't make it work exactly right when using the settings that it was suggesting. But I can make the system work with settings that I have discovered work for me. So your mileage may vary. You may be able to get consistent results doing exactly what the computer tells you to do. Trust me, after several hours and I don't know, several dozen attack runs, I just gave up on using exactly the settings that were being suggested because it just didn't work. So now I'm over the iron bombing test range, but still got a little bit to talk about here, so we're going round again, and then we'll get lined up. So the thing about using this technique, it's very good because it means you don't have to look up any of that or memorize any of that bombing table stuff that you have to do for basically every other aircraft, which is great. But there still are some issues with using this technique of trying to fly to fixed parameters and put the reticle on the target at the same time. And there are other ways of doing iron bombing. We've talked about them before, and we'll talk about them more in this video. But the basic problem is that even with this, you still have to get the dive angle, speed, and aim point all right at exactly the right altitude when the reticle happens to be over the target. That is a hard thing to do, to manage all of those parameters at the same time, as we shall see. The other issue is that this gives you no opportunity to adjust anything in real time. If you don't get exactly the roll-in that you expected to, you don't have any way of making a mental adjustment to actually try and improve your aim. So we'll just take our first run here at the target, and you'll notice that I still have the sight caged. So I'm still using the fixed sight. I'm going to have to switch that to the uncaged sight to actually get my bombing reticle, but I find it very hard to line up on the target using that reticle because it's so far off center. So now I've switched, now I just got to try and get that up to the target at the right altitude and pickle. See how we did. Okay, so a little bit long, and I could have guessed that because I think my pickle was a little bit late, and it was a little bit to the right because my rolling wasn't in line. So yeah, to go back to talking about that, the fixed sight, again, this is another issue with this bombing method where you're using essentially an offset target reticle that you have to put it over the target. The problem with that is that because that sight doesn't essentially move in a straight line, it rotates around the middle of your screen as you roll and then pull. It can be, at least for me, very challenging to get that reticle over the target, or to understand how to maneuver the jet to get it over the target when it isn't. It's much easier to move the center of the sight over the target because it basically moves where you want it to, because the airplane is rotating around it. This is something we've talked about before in the A4, because the center of the A4 sight is actually at the top of the first ring of the reticle, not in the middle of the screen. So the technique that I'm using here is, instead of switching to that uncaged sight before roll-in, I keep my sight caged until I've actually done the first part of the roll-in, until I'm aimed at the target. Then I switch to the uncaged sight and I gently pull myself up until that target reticles over the target. Now, of course, the other issue with that is that, again, because we're not using the center of the sight, we're using an offset. I have to keep adding forward pressure on the sight to keep that reticle on the target, because, of course, if I just let the jet dive, that reticle is going to move across the ground. So this is another limitation of this technique, that it does actually force you to always be making inputs in the dive to try and keep your sight picture consistent. And there are other ways of doing this that you won't have to do that, and we'll talk about that at the end of the video. So here we go again. Okay, now I've switched to the bombing sight. Just want to get the altitude at the right point. When my sight's over the target, that looked like a better setup. Yeah, there we go. That was a pretty good drop. So it is possible to get good results with this system. Now, I'll tell you that when I say good results, what I would hope to do is to get within about, let's say 25 meters of the target. And for me, consistently would be, I don't know, 4 times out of 5, maybe get within 25 meters. I think I'd like to do better than that, but I would call, if I can drop 4 times out of 5 and get within 25 meters, then I would say I'm doing pretty well. So let's go around and see if we can do that with a different target. Let's pick the white building down there. Nice large target, easier to see. This is one of the other issues, is that because the Sabre is a very fast diving jet, you really do have to roll in from higher than you do with other jets. I mean, 15,000 feet is much higher than we've done with other jets. And of course, there's limitations to that because of the weather, and also limitations to what you can see from up here. And the other thing about the Sabre is you really do have to watch your speed, especially at roll-in. So you may want to deploy your speed brakes even before you start the dive to try and keep that speed down. And you want to pull the throttle back substantially, just almost to the warning level. Okay, so we're rolling in on the white building. Again, I'm using the cage sight to try and get myself lined up, but as you can see, I'm having some trouble with alignment on this one. And when I switch to the bombing sight, when it starts to drift off, I'm having a hard time figuring out where to put it to get it back. So not a great roll in. And again, because I was mucking about with the alignment, I think I was late on my pickle, so we dropped long. So I think that well illustrates the issues that I'm talking about. This is not an easy thing to do to get everything lined up, and of course, you have to pickle pretty accurately to get within that 25 meters. There you can see how we did. Not bad, but not within 25 meters. And the issue is, even looking at that little sight altimeter, of course, it's pretty hard to judge exactly where that's pointed within, say, I don't know, 300 to 500 meters. And then it's even harder to try and actually hit the pickle button exactly right. So overall, this is not a technique that is going to be trying to drop stuff, in a pickle barrel, basically. And in fact, it's designed to be dropping bombs from 4,000 feet. There's not many jets, true iron bombing jets without a CCIP pipper, that you could expect to be dropping bombs from this height and to be getting within 25 meters consistently. In fact, even jets with the CCIP pipper, you have to be flying, fairly consistently to achieve those kinds of results from this altitude. So let's try it again. Bombing computer on. Once again, it's drifting, and I'm trying to rescue the situation, but my wings aren't level. I think I pick a little late again. Yeah, that one was way off. And that, I think, was partly just because I was really not well aligned. Didn't have my wings level because I was trying to, my rolling wasn't accurate in the first place. And so again, that's within 100 meters of the target, but only barely. So, part of that is just going to be overcome by practice. And while I fly a fair bit, I don't fly the F-86 very much at all. Jumped back into it in the last few days, maybe put 5-6 hours in. A pilot, professional pilot that flew the F-86 for a living would probably find it a lot easier to be consistent in ways that I'm not. And so this might not be as problematic if you're doing this for a living. But in sim, I have to say that I'm really having trouble having an accurate and precise enough roll in to, drop the bombs where I'd like to as consistently as I'd like to. And that's been my frustration with the F-86. It's a system that makes a lot of sense. I think it's a very elegant engineering solution, but it is pretty difficult to use if your standard is that you want to get within 25 meters, you know, 4 times out of 5 or something like that. Well, let's see. We'll do this one more time, see if we redeem ourselves a little bit. Once again, the target is the white building. Keep the cage sight up. I'm going to try and get the center dot as close as I can to that before I start to roll out too much. Get myself stabilized and wings level. Then switch to the bombing pipper. Still having some trouble keeping it centered. Better this time though. It's coming up, and try to get their sight on the target when the altitude's right. That wasn't bad that time. Alright, well, we actually destroyed the building this time. So, once again, you know, it is possible to drop bombs accurately using this method. I mean, I think I could use it to drop bombs on, like, installations from a good, safe altitude, like 4K. But I think if I'm going to be doing close air support or even battlefield interdiction, you know, attacking convoys and roads on stuff, I'm going to need something that lets me get an accuracy consistently better than what I can get with this method. Again, that may be my limitation, but I felt like I needed something a bit better if I'm going to use the F-86 in a close air support role. So here we are. We're going to try a different method that I've been working on. Now, in this, I call this the fixed sight method because we aren't actually going to ever change the sight out of its caged mode. Now, I'm going to set it to 70 feet wingspan. I'll explain that in a minute. And now we need to go back and we have to redo the switchology here. Just get pointed in the right direction. Set the sight to camera only, so we're not going to use the guns. We need to set the bombs to all. That's the middle switch. There we go. And we need to set the sight mode to bombing. Okay, so this method of bombing is going to use the method that I've used and talked about in other videos, which is the fixed point aim off method. And it's going to be designed to drop our bombs at about 2,000 feet. That's what the actual size of the reticle is going to give us. So setting it to 70-foot wingspan, I have discovered gives me about a release altitude of around 2,000. So I've set my altimeter to that. Now, if you want to try this at different settings, the smaller you make the wingspan setting on the sight, the lower you're going to end up dropping your bombs. And alternatively, the larger you make it, the higher you are. So the way this is going to work is that we are going to keep the fixed sight on screen. We're going to put the center dot over the target when we roll in. Then we're going to pull that dot up to a fixed aim-off mark, and we're going to try and hold it there consistently through the whole dive. And when the bottom of the reticle touches the target, that's when we're going to release. So you can see that's why the size of the sight affects the altitude at which we release. We're using about the same dive angle as we did the last time, and about the same speed, although this method I don't think is quite as sensitive to those things as the other method. They still matter, so you will be repaid for having a consistent roll-in. So I am picking up the target. Now I am moving my pipper to a fixed point, trying to hold it there, and then as the bottom of the sight crosses the target, I release, and hey presto, target round. So I won't pretend that I did that the first time around. I have been practicing this method for a while, and so I know particularly with that target pretty much exactly what my aim off has to be. And as you can see, it was a little bit beyond the circle. The circle's 50 meters. I'm going to call it 75 meters beyond the target. So just to test to see if we can get good results, you know, on a target that I haven't practiced on over and over again. Let's go back and let's try that white building again. So we're going to have to mentally have a picture about what 75 meters looks like on the ground when we roll in. And so basically we're going to have to kind of, you know, based on the local geography, we're going to have to pick a point where we want to put the pipper. Now, if you were doing this, if you're doing this in a prepared way, in a mission where you were preparing for the target, you could actually take a look, do a map survey and figure out, you know, some marks on the ground that looked about the right distance from the target. If you're doing this for target of opportunity, you're just going to have to depend on your own, you know, sense of how big things are on the ground and what they look like in the cockpit, but that's what we practice for, right? So, again, you can see, by the way, the drop height there was about 2,000 feet. I apologize, the target information tracking system data is not coming on screen. It's a bug that I need to talk to the developer about that I don't I'm using the replay here, and for some reason in the replay, I'm not getting the target information tracking script data. But you can still see how the rounds land, even if you're not getting the numerical data, so it shouldn't be too bad. So once again, timing the roll in, we're just flying a beam just under the cockpit rim when I'm rolled about 10-15 degrees. Again, now we pull up. Now I'm going to try and get the roll in so that I start with the pipper over the target, and roll in, get wings level, get lined up, and then I'm going to pull beyond the target, and I'm going to try and pick a fixed point and go. And we'll see how we did. Okay, now we were a little bit to the right, and that makes sense because I was a little bit to the right, and we were a little bit long. So the rule is, when using the aim off method, is that if you land long, aim longer. If you land short, aim shorter. There's trigonometry involved, but it does make sense, because basically how far away you aim from the target controls when you drop. And the farther away that you aim from the target, the earlier you'll drop, because the sooner the bottom of the sight will cross the target, if that makes sense. So we land a little long, so we need to aim a little longer, and that will actually cause us to drop at a slightly higher altitude. And that altitude, if you wanted to check, was a little bit under 2,000 feet that time. We are going to aim just a little bit longer. And again, we just have to kind of memorize that sight picture. There's no specific thing on the ground I'm looking at. I'm looking at the buildings on each side. I'm looking at the white building. I'm just basically memorizing what the picture looks like when I've got the pipper at about the right place. And then we're going to essentially just repeat the same thing, fly to the point on the ground, and let the pipper move up to the target on its own. Now, if we're trimmed right, and it takes a little bit to get trimmed right in the Sabre, it does pick up a lot of, the nose wants to rise as you pick up speed, so you may need to even be trimming as you're diving. But it's really important to try and have a nice, consistent dive where you're diving at a point on the ground. You're just waiting for the pipper to cross the target. And that's why I like this method more than the other method, because I find it just easier to manage everything in the dive. So once again, let's get the pipper up to the target, then let's get it beyond. Maybe a little bit more than that. I'm just trying to ease it up. Okay, right about there. And there. Now we were to the right again, but much better in terms of hitting the target. So I think it can work. I think that this is unlike the other method, where I'm probably 1 or 2 times out of 5 that I'm getting within the 25 meters that I'm looking for. With this method, I would say I'm with a little bit of practice, I'm pretty close to 4 out of 5. That was 2 out of 3. And I think I could probably achieve that fairly consistently after a little bit of practice. But again, as with everything in iron bombing and DCS, it is all about the practice. I'm only actually able to be as consistent as I am because I have spent a fair bit of time on the range in the last few days getting ready to record this video. And again, this is a non-standard technique. You won't find it anywhere else in any manuals anywhere. But it works for me. I'd be interested to know what you think of it. Be interested to know if you can make some variations on it, if you can make it work. Try a different sight size, and just let me know what you think of the technique. At any rate, this has finally been my F-86 Sabre bombing video. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, please like and subscribe. And for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.